July 18. 1918. 18,000 feet above the scarred landscape of the Western Front, the freezing wind whips through the open cockpit of the white Fokker WWII, stinging the exposed skin of the pilot's face. Captain Hermann Göring adjusts his leather goggles. His eyes scanning the cloud breaks for the silhouette of Allied fighters. He grips the control stick with leather-gloved hands, feeling the vibration of the engine that separates him from the deathly silence of the altitude. Around his neck hangs the Pour le Mérite, the blue max, glittering in the cold sunlight, a symbol of Germany's highest honor and his own supreme vanity. This is not just any patrol. Göring is leading the Jagdgeschwader, the legendary flying circus formerly commanded by the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen. Since taking command earlier that month, Göring has fought to impose his will upon the elite squadron, many of whom viewed him as an outsider. He is aggressive, flamboyant, and utterly fearless, flying with a terrifying grace that has already claimed 22 confirmed aerial victories. In the thin air above the trenches, he feels invincible, a knight of the sky detached from the muddy slaughter taking place miles below him. However, the war on the ground is crumbling, and by November, the invincibility of the German Empire shatters completely. When the armistice is signed, the order comes to surrender their beloved aircraft to the advancing Allied forces, a command that strikes Göring as a profound betrayal. He considers refusing the order entirely, threatening to crash his planes rather than hand them over to the French and Americans. In a final act of defiance, he leads his squadron back to Germany. But many of his pilots intentionally damage their landing gear upon arrival to spite the victors. The Germany that Göring returns to is unrecognizable, stripped of its imperial glory and plunged into revolution and chaos. Marxist uprisings and street battles replace the orderly military parades of his youth, and officers are stripped of their rank insignia by angry mobs. Disgusted by the Weimar Republic and feeling that the army was stabbed in the back by politicians, Göring leaves his homeland. He drifts north to Denmark and Sweden, working as a commercial pilot and a barnstormer, performing stunts for crowds who have no idea they are watching a war hero. It is during this period of exile in Sweden that he encounters a figure who will shape his destiny as much as any political leader. On a snowy winter day at Rockelstad Castle, he meets Karin von Kanso, a Swedish aristocrat unhappily married to an army officer. Their connection is instant and intense, fueled by a shared romanticism and a disdain for the mundane world. Karin sees in Göring a Siegfried figure, a fallen hero from Germanic legend, while Göring finds in her the aristocratic validation and unwavering devotion he craves. Despite this romantic interlude, the pull of the fatherland remains too strong to ignore for long. In 1922, Göring returns to Munich, the hotbed of right-wing radicalism and discontent against the Treaty of Versailles. He enrolls at the university to study history and political science. But the lecture halls cannot hold the attention of a man addicted to adrenaline. He wanders the beer halls and political rallies, searching for a cause that can restore Germany's honor and, by extension, his own purpose. It is here that he hears whispers of a mesmerizing orator named Adolf Hitler. One evening, Göring stands at the back of a smoke-filled room, listening as Hitler speaks with hypnotic fury against the November criminals and the Jewish conspiracy he claims is destroying the nation. Göring is transfixed, not just by the message, but by the raw power the man commands over the crowd. Afterward, they meet, and the chemistry is immediate and mutually beneficial. Hitler needs a war hero with social connections and the blue max to lend legitimacy to his ragtag party. Göring needs a messiah to follow. Hitler quickly appoints Göring as the commander of the Sturmabteilung, the SA, also known as the Brown Shirts. At this stage, the SA is little more than a disorganized mob of brawlers and thugs used to intimidate political opponents. Göring applies his military training to the rabble, instilling discipline, organizing them into marching columns, and outfitting them with better equipment. He transforms the street fighters into a paramilitary force, enjoying the feeling of command once again, barking orders and reviewing troops just as he did on the front lines. By the autumn of 1923, the German economy has collapsed into hyperinflation, with a wheelbarrow of marks barely buying a loaf of bread. The atmosphere in Munich is electric with the promise of revolution, and the Nazis decide the time has come to seize power. Göring is at the center of the planning, his confidence radiating through the ranks of the SA. They plan to kidnap the leaders of the Bavarian government and force them to support a march on Berlin, mirroring Mussolini's march on Rome the previous year. On the night of November 8, 1923, the plan goes into motion at the Bürgerbräukeller, a massive beer hall in Munich. Göring strides in alongside Hitler, his steel helmet gleaming, his heavy trench coat concealing his weaponry. As Hitler fires a shot into the ceiling to silence the crowd, Göring steps forward to manage the terrifying chaos. He bellows at the confused audience to stay calm, famously declaring that they have nothing to fear as long as they have their beer. The coup seems to be succeeding as they take the government officials hostage. The following morning, however, the situation deteriorates rapidly as the Bavarian government leaders manage to escape and renounce their forced support. Despite this, Hitler and Göring decide to march through the streets of Munich, believing the army and police will not fire on a World War I hero like Ludendorff, who marches with them. Thousands of brown shirts link arms, singing patriotic songs, moving toward the War Ministry in a column that stretches through the narrow city streets. Göring marches in the front row, his chest swelling with the anticipation of victory. As the column reaches the Odeonsplatz near the Feldherrnhalle, they find their path blocked by a cordon of armed state police. For a moment, there is a standoff, a silent confrontation between the revolutionaries and the guardians of the state. Then, a single shot rings out its source unknown and immediately triggers a volley of fire from the police. Chaos erupts as the marchers scatter, screaming and diving for cover on the cobblestones. Hitler dislocates his shoulder as the man linked to him is killed, dragging him to the ground. Göring is not so lucky. A police bullet smashes into his upper right thigh and groin, tearing through muscle and grazing the bone. He falls to the street, bleeding profusely, the pain instantaneous and blinding. The Iron Man is rendered helpless in seconds, surrounded by the dead and dying members of the movement he helped build. As the police advance, loyal SA men drag Göring's heavy frame into a nearby house at Residenzstrasse 25 to save him from immediate arrest. Ironically, the house belongs to a Jewish furniture maker named Robert Ballin, who, despite the Nazi platform, shows mercy to the bleeding man. Ballin's wife dresses Göring's wound as best she can while the police hunt for the coup leaders outside. Under the cover of darkness, his supporters smuggle him out of the city and eventually across the border into Austria. The journey is a nightmare of agony for Göring, his wound becoming severely infected as they navigate the rough terrain to escape the German authorities. Once safe in Innsbruck, he is taken to a hospital where surgeons operate to save his leg and his life. The infection is deep, and the recovery is slow and excruciatingly painful. To manage the unyielding agony, the Austrian doctors begin administering injections of morphine. At first, it is a medical necessity, a mercy to a suffering patient who screams whenever his dressings are changed. The drug brings a warm, enveloping silence that dulls not just the physical pain, but the humiliation of the failed putsch. For Göring, the morphine offers an escape from the reality of his exile, his poverty, and his warrant for treason back in Germany. He begins to crave the needle not just for pain relief, but for the euphoric sense of power and well-being it provides. The doses increase in frequency and potency, and soon, the charismatic air ace is replaced by a man enslaved by the opiate. The blue Max hero of the Great War has begun his descent, and the needle has become his new master. September 1, 1925. The sterile white walls of the Långbro Asylum in Sweden echo with the screams of a madman, confined within a padded cell, strapped tightly into a straitjacket that restrains his thrashing limbs, is the former commander of the Richthofen squadron. Hermann Göring has lost his war against the morphine needle. The drug, initially a salve for his infected gunshot wound, has dismantled his mind, turning the confident aristocrat into a paranoid, violent wreck who recently attacked a nurse in a fit of withdrawal-induced rage. His weight has ballooned uncontrollably due to metabolic damage, stripping away his dashing pilot's physique and replacing it with the heavy, bloated frame that will become his trademark. Outside the asylum walls, his devoted wife Karin is fighting her own battle against failing health. Her heart is weak, and she suffers from tuberculosis. Yet she exhausts her dwindling financial resources and social capital to support her husband. The couple has lost everything: their home in Munich, their possessions, and their status, to the Swedish doctors assessing him. Göring is not a political refugee or a war hero, but a dangerous drug addict classified as legally insane. This period marks the absolute nadir of his life, a humiliation so profound that he will later erase it from his official biography, ensuring the German public never learns of the straitjacket. By 1927, the political winds in Germany shift once again as the aging President Paul over Hindenburg declares a general amnesty for political refugees. A tentative stability has returned to the Weimar Republic, and the immediate threat of revolution seems to have passed. Göring, now released from the asylum and temporarily weaned off the heaviest doses of morphine, sees his chance to reclaim his destiny. He returns to Berlin, not as a conquering hero, but as a man desperate for redemption and purpose. He reconnects with Adolf Hitler, who is rebuilding the Nazi Party through legal political means rather than armed coups. Hitler immediately recognizes that Göring still possesses something. The rough street fighters of the party lack social grace and connections to the old elite, while Joseph Goebbels agitates the working class and Heinrich Himmler organizes the protective squads. Göring is tasked with charming the aristocracy and the industrialists. He hosts lavish dinner parties, wearing his pour le mérite, and convinces nervous steel barons and conservative generals that the Nazis are not chaotic revolutionaries, but patriotic nationalists. He becomes the acceptable face of the movement, the bridge between the gutter politics of the brown shirts and the drawing rooms of high society. In the pivotal elections of 1928, Göring secures a seat in the Reichstag as one of only 12 Nazi deputies. Although the party is still a fringe minority, this position grants him legal immunity and a public platform. He uses the parliament floor not to govern, but to sabotage the democratic process from within. With his booming voice and imposing presence, he disrupts sessions, insults opposition leaders, and mocks the very institutions he swore to serve. Yet, outside the chamber, he continues to cultivate friendships with foreign diplomats and conservative politicians, playing a double game of arsonist and firefighter. The Great Depression of 1929 plunges Germany back into misery, and the Nazi vote surges as the economy collapses. By July 1932, the Nazis are the largest party in the Reichstag, and Göring is elected president of the parliament. He now holds the gavel in the very building he despises, using his power to manipulate parliamentary procedures and block any attempts by the moderate government to stabilize the crisis. He masterfully engineers vote of no confidence after vote of no confidence, ensuring that the Weimar Republic remains in a state of permanent paralysis. On January 30, 1933, the maneuvering pays off. Adolf Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany. While other Nazis clamour for high-profile national ministries, Göring shrewdly demands the post of Prussian Minister of the Interior. It seems like a lesser prize to some, but Göring understands the true mechanics of power. This position gives him direct control over the Prussian police force, the largest and most powerful security apparatus in the Reich. He immediately begins a ruthless purge, firing professional Republican officers and replacing them with hardened SA stormtroopers and SS men. Göring issues a notorious order known as the Shooting Decree, which fundamentally alters the role of the police in Germany. He instructs his officers to use their firearms without hesitation against enemies of the state, promising them his personal protection from any legal consequences. He famously declares in a speech that his measures will not be burdened by legal scruples or bureaucracy, stating that his business is not to do justice, but to destroy and exterminate. The police, once the guardians of the law, are transformed overnight into the personal enforcement arm of the Nazi Party. Then comes the night of February 27, 1933. Göring is working late at the Prussian Ministry of the Interior when the phone rings with a frantic report: the Reichstag is burning. He rushes to the scene, his heavy leather coat flapping as he strides toward the glowing orange silhouette of the Parliament building. The great glass dome is engulfed in flames, shattering from the intense heat. Inside, police arrest a confused, half-blind Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe. For Göring, the identity of the arsonist is almost irrelevant. The opportunity the fire presents is everything. Standing amidst the smoking ruins and shattered glass, Göring meets Hitler, who has arrived in a state of manic agitation. Göring immediately seizes the narrative, bellowing that this fire is the signal for a communist uprising, the beginning of a Bolshevik revolution that must be crushed with an iron fist. Whether the Nazis engineered the fire themselves or simply exploited a lucky accident remains a subject of debate. But Göring's reaction is calculated and immediate. He demands the immediate arrest of thousands of communists and social democrats, claiming the state is under existential threat. The following day, based on Göring's terrifying reports of an imminent revolution, Hindenburg signs the Reichstag fire decree. This single piece of paper suspends civil liberties, habeas corpus, and freedom of the press. It is the legal death warrant of German democracy. Göring unleashes his Nazified police force, rounding up political opponents by the thousands. Makeshift prisons and torture cellars spring up across Berlin, filled with those who dared to oppose the new order. To manage this new terror state, Göring creates a new secret police department, known by its sinister acronym the Gestapo. However, a new threat arises from within the party itself. Ernst Röhm, the leader of the SA, commands over 3 million brown shirts and is demanding a second revolution to dismantle the army and the traditional elites. Röhm's ambition threatens the alliance Göring has carefully built with the military and the industrialists. Göring, who once drilled the SA, now views them as a liability and a personal threat to his accumulated power. He forms a temporary, lethal alliance with his rival Heinrich Himmler and his deputy Reinhard Heydrich to neutralize the SA leadership. Throughout the spring of 1934, Göring and Himmler feed Hitler falsified reports and manufactured evidence suggesting that Röhm is planning a coup to overthrow the Chancellor. They play on Hitler's paranoia, slowly convincing him that his oldest friend in the party is a traitor. Göring is particularly ruthless in this conspiracy, driven by his desire to be the undisputed head of the armed forces and the sole master of the German state apparatus. The stage is set for a purge that will eliminate all opposition, both inside and outside the party. On June 30, 1934, the code word Hummingbird is issued, initiating the Night of the Long Knives. While Hitler flies to Munich to personally arrest Röhm, Göring remains in Berlin to direct the slaughter in the capital. From his personal residence, he coordinates the SS and police death squads. He works down a list of names, casually marking off those who are to be executed. This is not just a purge of the SA. Göring uses the chaos to settle old scores, adding the names of conservative critics and former political rivals to the death list. One of the victims is General Kurt von Schleicher, the former chancellor who had once outmaneuvered the Nazis. On Göring's orders, SS men storm Schleicher's home and gun him down in his doorway alongside his wife. Another is Gregor Strasser, a rival Nazi ideologue. As the reports of the assassinations flow back to his office, Göring maintains a cold, bureaucratic detachment. He is reshaping the German state with bullets, ensuring that no power block remains that can challenge Hitler or himself. By the time the shooting stops on July 2, hundreds are dead. The SA is broken, reduced to a toothless marching band. Göring emerges from the bloodbath as the undisputed second man in the Reich, a general of the police, and soon, the commander of a new military branch. He hands over control of the Gestapo to Himmler, a tactical concession, because his eyes are now fixed on a grander prize. In the secret hangars and design bureaus, he is preparing to unveil the weapon that he believes will secure Germany's dominance forever, the Luftwaffe. It is March 1935, and the skies over Berlin roar with a sound that has been forbidden for nearly 2 decades. Squadrons of silver biplanes and modern monoplanes streak overhead in precise formation, openly defying the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles. Hermann Göring stands on the reviewing stand next to Adolf Hitler, his chest bursting with pride as he officially unveils the Luftwaffe to the stunned world. He has spent years developing pilots in secret glider clubs and testing prototype aircraft in Soviet Russia, hiding his air force in plain sight. Now, as the commander-in-chief, he presents this metallic armada not just as a military branch, but as a personal fiefdom, a weapon forged in his own image of aggression and speed. By 1936, Göring's hunger for power extends far beyond the airfield and into the very heart of the German economy. Hitler appoints him plenipotentiary of the 4-year plan, granting him dictatorial control over industry, imports, and raw materials to prepare the nation for war. He knows little of economics. Treating complex financial systems with the blunt force of a stormtrooper, he bullies captains of industry, demanding they shift production from consumer goods to tanks and synthetic rubber, famously declaring that guns will make them strong, while butter only makes them fat. Under his chaotic and corrupt leadership, the German economy transforms into a war machine, cannibalizing its own resources to prepare for a conflict that is rapidly approaching. While the nation tightens its belt under his economic decrees, Göring retreats to the Schorfheide forest north of Berlin to construct a monument to his own ego. He names the estate Karinhall in honor of his first wife, whose remains he transfers to a lavish mausoleum on the grounds. This is no mere hunting lodge, it is a sprawling palace of rustic timber and stone, filled with bearskins, enormous tapestries, and heavy Gothic furniture. Here, he plays the role of a Renaissance prince, holding court in a vast great hall where an electric train set winds through the room, delighting guests with its childish complexity. It is a surreal kingdom where the Reichsmarschall escapes the drab reality of the Nazi bureaucracy. The walls of Karinhall begin to fill with Europe's treasures, signaling the start of the greatest art heist in history. Göring develops an insatiable appetite for old masters, sculptures, and religious artifacts, often bullying Jewish collectors into selling them for a pittance or simply confiscating them outright through his police connections. He spends hours changing his attire, designing flamboyant uniforms for himself, ranging from white gala suits to soft green hunting leathers, often accessorized with a jewel-encrusted dagger and a marshal's baton. To his guests, he appears almost comical, a bloated peacock strutting through his stolen luxury. Yet behind the velvet and gold lies a predator who views the world as a storehouse for his personal gratification. Despite his grotesque excess, the German public adores him, viewing him with a strange, affectionate tolerance that they deny other Nazi leaders. While Hitler is distant and ascetic, and Joseph Goebbels is intellectual and malicious, Göring is seen as Unser Hermann or Our Hermann. He is jovial, approachable, and seemingly human, shaking hands with workers and cracking jokes that circulate in the beer halls. He carefully cultivates this image of the Falstaffian soldier, using his natural charisma to mask the deep corruption that rots the core of his administration. To the average citizen, his greed is seen as a lovable quirk rather than the looting of a nation's wealth. The jovial image evaporates instantly when one looks at the actions of his beloved Luftwaffe in Spain. In 1937, Göring seizes the opportunity of the Spanish Civil War to test his new pilots and machines under combat conditions. He dispatches the Condor Legion to support General Franco, treating the conflict as a live-fire training exercise for the coming World War. On April 26, his bombers descend upon the Basque town of Guernica on Market Day, raining high explosives and incendiaries on the civilian population. The ancient town is pulverized. Hundreds are incinerated, and the world recoils in horror. Göring dismisses the international outrage with a wave of his hand, coldly noting that his crews needed the practice. Back in Berlin, Göring's ruthlessness turns toward the leadership of the Wehrmacht as he seeks to remove the last obstacles to war. In early 1938, he orchestrates the downfall of Field Marshal von Blomberg and General von Fritsch through scandalous revelations and trumped-up charges. He acts as the weeping friend to Blomberg while handing the damaging evidence to Hitler, destroying the man's career to clear the path for his own promotion to Field Marshal. When the Anschluss with Austria occurs weeks later, Göring dominates the telephone lines, bullying the Austrian government into submission and threatening invasion, ensuring the annexation is completed without a single shot being fired by the army he now overshadows. The year ends with the shattered glass of Kristallnacht, a nationwide pogrom that litters the streets with the debris of Jewish businesses and synagogues. While Goebbels instigates the street violence, it is Göring who steps in to monetize the tragedy. He calls a meeting of high-ranking officials and furiously scolds them, not for the violence, but for the destruction of valuable property that could have been seized for the state. He imposes a crushing fine of 1 billion marks on the German Jewish community to pay for the damage inflicted upon them. It is a masterclass in cynicism, converting state-sponsored terror into a financial windfall for his 4-year plan. Amidst the gathering storm clouds of war, Göring remarries, choosing the actress Emmy Sonnemann as his bride in a wedding that rivals a royal coronation. With Hitler as the best man, the ceremony is a spectacle of pomp and circumstance. With fighter planes flying overhead and thousands lining the streets to cheer the couple, Emmy becomes the unofficial First Lady of the Reich. Filling the void left by the bachelor Hitler, they host grand receptions at Hall, creating a glittering social circle that blinds foreign diplomats to the true nature of the regime. Göring plays the loving husband and father, cooing over his newborn daughter Edda, presenting a facade of domestic bliss while signing orders that will doom millions. As the summer of 1939 fades, the drive toward war with Poland becomes irreversible. But for the first time, Göring hesitates. Unlike Hitler, who is eager for bloodshed, Göring enjoys his life of luxury and fears a major conflict with the British Empire could destroy the opulent world he has built. He engages in unauthorized back-channel diplomacy with a Swedish businessman, Birger Dalarus, desperately trying to broker a peace deal with London behind Hitler's back. It is a gamble driven by self-preservation rather than morality. He knows the Luftwaffe is powerful, but he also knows it is not ready for a long, drawn-out war of attrition against the combined might of the West. His clumsy diplomatic efforts fail, and Hitler's resolve for war crushes Göring's hesitation. When he realizes that the Führer cannot be swayed, Göring snaps back into line. Terrified of losing his status as the second man in the Reich, he abandons his peace efforts and turns his energy toward preparing the Luftwaffe for the assault on Warsaw. On the eve of the invasion, he reportedly tells a subordinate that if they lose this war, heaven help them all. The architect of terror suppresses his doubts, puts on his uniform, and prepares to unleash the devastating power he has nurtured for 4 years, knowing the gamble could cost him everything. September 1, 1939. The dawn breaks over Poland with a terrifying screech that will soon haunt the nightmares of an entire continent. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers peel out of the sky, their wind-driven sirens wailing a psychological death knell before the high explosives shatter the earth below. Hermann Göring monitors the progress from his mobile command train, watching with satisfaction as his Luftwaffe obliterates the Polish Air Force, largely while it still sits on the tarmac. This is the debut of Blitzkrieg, and the air arm is the spear tip, blasting a path for the armored columns to race forward. Within weeks, Warsaw is reduced to a smoldering ruin, a testament to the devastating efficiency of the weapon Göring has forged. Following the swift conquest of Poland, a deceptive calm settles over the Western Front, a period known as the Phony War. Göring uses this time to bask in the glow of his initial success, convinced that the Western Allies have no stomach for a real fight. However, when the invasion of France and the Low Countries launches in May 1940, the speed of the German advance surprises even the German High Command. The Wehrmacht slices through the Ardennes, trapping the British Expeditionary Force against the sea at Dunkirk. It is here that Göring makes a fateful intervention that will alter the course of the war. Desperate to claim the glory of the final victory for himself and his air force, Göring telephones Hitler on May 23. He assures the Führer that his bombers alone can annihilate the trapped British troops on the beaches, rendering a ground assault unnecessary. He argues that the panzer divisions, worn down by weeks of fighting, should be preserved for the final push into France. Hitler, trusting his old comrade and wary of the marshy terrain around Dunkirk, agrees and issues the famous halt order. For 3 days, the tanks stop, while Göring's planes are grounded by heavy fog and bad weather, allowing the Royal Navy to evacuate over 300,000 soldiers who will live to fight another day. Despite this strategic blunder, the fall of France in June 1940 is hailed as a miraculous triumph, and Göring is showered with accolades. On July 19, in a grand ceremony at the Kroll Opera House in Berlin, Hitler promotes a dozen generals to the rank of Field Marshal. But for Göring, he creates a unique, supreme rank Reichsmarschall of the Greater German Reich. He is presented with an oversized, diamond-encrusted baton and a certificate confirming his status as the highest-ranking officer in Nazi Germany. At this moment, standing in his specially designed pale blue uniform, Göring reaches the absolute zenith of his power and prestige. The war now turns toward the only remaining enemy, Great Britain. Göring establishes his headquarters on his luxurious private train, named Asia. Parked near the coast of the English Channel at Cap Gris-Nez, he gazes across the narrow strip of water toward the white cliffs of Dover. Brimming with overconfidence, he dismisses the Royal Air Force as a collection of amateurs and laughs off reports about the strange British radio towers along the coast. Failing to grasp the significance of their radar network, he assures Hitler that his Luftwaffe will smash the British air defences in 4 days, paving the way for Operation Sea Lion, the amphibious invasion of England. On August 13, 1940, the operation code named Adlertag, or Eagle Day, commences. Hundreds of Heinkel and Dornier bombers, escorted by swarms of Messerschmitt fighters, roar across the Channel to strike British airfields and radar stations. The sky becomes a chaotic mosaic of contrails and machine gun fire as the British Hurricanes and Spitfires rise to meet them. Göring, commanding from his train far from the danger, fails to understand the tactical reality his pilots face. The German fighters are operating at the limit of their fuel range, leaving them only minutes of combat time over England before they must turn back, leaving the bombers vulnerable to slaughter. Throughout late August, the battle grinds on with brutal intensity. The Luftwaffe hammers the RAF sector stations, slowly crippling the British ability to launch intercepts. The British fighter command is nearing the breaking point, running out of pilots and serviceable airfields. However, Göring grows impatient with the lack of a quick victory. He berates his fighter aces, accusing them of cowardice for not sticking close enough to the bombers, ignoring their pleas that tying the fighters to the slow-moving bombers negates their speed and maneuverability. The disconnect between the bloated Reichsmarschall and the exhausted men flying his planes widens into a chasm of resentment. Then, a singular event shifts the entire strategy. On the night of August 25, a small force of RAF bombers manages to reach Berlin, dropping bombs on the German capital. The physical damage is negligible, but the psychological blow is catastrophic. Göring had famously boasted to the German people years earlier that if a single enemy plane ever dropped a bomb on the Ruhr, they could call him Meyer, a common Jewish name. The raid on Berlin makes a mockery of his promise and sends Hitler into a blind rage. The Führer demands immediate retaliation, ordering the Luftwaffe to switch its targets from the military airfields to the city of London itself. Göring, eager to appease Hitler and regain his lost face, complies without hesitation. On September 7, he directs massive waves of bombers toward the British capital, initiating the Blitz. The docks and the East End of London erupt in flames, and thousands of civilians are killed. From a propaganda standpoint, the destruction looks apocalyptic, and Göring believes he is breaking the British morale. In reality, he has just saved the Royal Air Force. By shifting the target to the cities, he gives the battered British airfields precious weeks to repair their runways and communications, allowing Fighter Command to recover its strength just when it was on the ropes. The climax arrives on September 15, now known as Battle of Britain Day. Believing the RAF is down to its last 50 Spitfires, Göring launches a massive, all-out assault on London, expecting no resistance. Instead, his bomber formations are met by hundreds of British fighters, fully organized and attacking with renewed ferocity. The sky rains burning aluminum as the Luftwaffe suffers staggering losses. With over 60 aircraft shot down, the German pilots return to their bases in France, shaken and demoralized. Finally realizing that the promise of air superiority was a lie, the invasion of England is indefinitely postponed, marking the first major defeat for Hitler's Germany. In the aftermath, Göring's standing with Hitler begins a slow, irreversible decline. The Führer does not strip him of his titles, But the warmth leaves their relationship. Hitler begins to bypass Göring on military matters, speaking with disdain about the Luftwaffe's failure to deliver the promised victory. Göring, unable to handle the criticism or the reality of his strategic incompetence, begins to retreat physically and mentally. He spends less time at the front and more time at Carrenhall or Romington, hosting hunting parties and burying his shame in food, art, and an increasing reliance on paracodaine tablets. The eagle's wings have been clipped, but the war is far from over, as 1940 bleeds into 1941. The focus of the war shifts east, toward the vast steppes of the Soviet Union. Göring is skeptical of the plan to invade Russia, fearing a two-front war that destroyed Germany in the previous conflict. Yet, he lacks the moral courage to stand up to Hitler. Instead, he turns his attention to the economic plunder of the conquered territories, drawing up ruthless plans to starve millions of Slavs to feed the German army. The failed air commander reinvents himself as the monstrous architect of economic exploitation, trying to secure his position through greed rather than victory. As the preparations for Operation Barbarossa begin, Göring assures the generals that the Soviet Air Force is a primitive joke that will be wiped out in days. He falls back into his habit of bluster and bravado, ignoring the logistical nightmares that a campaign in Russia entails. He tells his staff that the Luftwaffe will supply the army as it races toward Moscow, a promise made with the same casual arrogance that led to the failure over Britain. He is setting the stage for a disaster of unimaginable scale, one where his pilots will face not just enemy fire, but the brutal, freezing indifference of the Russian winter. The golden era of the Luftwaffe has ended in the skies over the English Channel, though few in Germany realize it yet. The invincible aura of the Reichsmarschall is tarnished, replaced by whispered jokes about his weight and his drug habit. Göring senses the change in the wind. Feeling the cold draft of Hitler's displeasure, he compensates by adding more jewels to his fingers and more medals to his chest. A shimmering facade covering a man who is hollowed out by addiction and the gnawing fear that he has led his nation into an abyss from which there is no return. The winter of 1942 descends upon the Eastern Front with a ferocity that freezes oil in engine blocks and snaps steel like glass. Deep in the heart of the Soviet Union, the German Sixth Army, once the proud spearhead of the Wehrmacht, finds itself trapped in the ruins of Stalingrad. Operation Uranus, a massive Soviet counter-offensive, has snapped the jaws of a trap shut around nearly 300,000 German soldiers. General Friedrich Paulus is encircled, cut off from supply lines and facing annihilation. In the Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler stares at the situation map, refusing to allow a retreat. He looks for a miracle to save his prestige, and once again, Hermann Göring steps forward to offer a lie that will seal the fate of 250,000 men. During a tense conference in November, the chief of the General Staff, Kurt Zeitzler, argues furiously that the Sixth Army must break out immediately before they are starved into submission. Hitler hesitates, terrified of giving up the symbolic city that bears Stalin's name. Into this desperate atmosphere steps Göring, who is initially reached by telephone, without consulting his transport experts or calculating the logistical realities. He casually assures Hitler that the Luftwaffe can supply the trapped army by air. He cites the successful airlift at the Demyansk pocket earlier that year as proof, willfully ignoring that Stalingrad requires a volume of supplies vastly larger than anything the Luftwaffe has ever attempted before. The mathematics of survival are brutal and unforgiving. The Sixth Army requires a minimum of 700 tons of food, fuel, and ammunition every single day just to maintain combat effectiveness, or 300 tons merely to survive. Göring puffs on his cigar and grandly promises 500 tons a day, effectively guaranteeing the army's safety. It is a boast born of vanity and a desperate need to regain the Führer's favor after the failures in the Battle of Britain. When the Luftwaffe's actual transport commanders hear of the promise, they are horrified, knowing they lack the aircraft, the fuel, and the pilots to deliver even a fraction of that tonnage in the brutal Russian winter. The operation begins in December, and it is an immediate disaster. The primary transport plane, the trimotor Junkers Ju-52, is slow, vulnerable, and unsuited for the extreme conditions. Soviet anti-aircraft batteries ring the city, creating a corridor of death that the German pilots must fly through day and night. Blizzards ground the fleet for days at a time, and when planes do manage to land at the cratered Pitomnik airfield, they are often unable to take off again due to mechanical failures or Soviet shelling. On the best days, the airlift delivers barely 100 tons. On the worst days, nothing arrives but the howling wind. Inside the Kessel, or cauldron, the reality of Göring's broken promise is measured in frozen corpses. Soldiers, starving and ridden with typhus, hack the flesh from dead horses to make a watery broth. They scan the grey skies with hollow eyes, waiting for the roar of engines that rarely comes. When supply canisters do drop, they often contain useless items sent by an incompetent bureaucracy, boxes of pepper, marjoram, and thousands of contraceptives instead of the bread and bullets the dying men desperate need. The name Göring becomes a curse word among the troops, a symbol of the betrayal by the high command that sits in warmth while they freeze in hell. While the Sixth Army slowly dies, the Reichsmarschall is busy preparing for his own glorification. On January 12, 1943, just weeks before the final surrender at Stalingrad, Göring celebrates his 50th birthday. The event is a grotesque display of opulence amidst a world of total war. He unwraps lavish gifts from sycophantic industrialists and party officials, including a pure gold casket from Hitler and substantial cash bribes. He wears a specially designed gala uniform, changing his outfit multiple times throughout the day, and plays with his massive electric train set in the attic of Karen Hall, seemingly oblivious to the telegrams from General Paulus detailing the mass starvation of his troops. This disconnect from reality is fueled by his deepening addiction to dihydrocodeine, a mild opiate he consumes in massive quantities. His nurse and personal physician, Dr. Ondra, dispense the pills which Göring eats like candy, often taking up to 30 tablets a day. The drugs dampen his anxiety and allow him to drift into a euphoric haze, but they also wreck his hormonal balance and concentration. He experiences wild mood swings, shifting from manic energy to comatose lethargy in the span of an hour. To hide the physical toll, he begins wearing rouge on his cheeks and painting his fingernails with clear varnish, presenting a bizarre, almost drag-like appearance that terrifies and confuses his sober subordinates. As the military situation collapses, Göring retreats into his other great obsession, the systematic looting of Europe's art treasures. He utilizes a special task force, rivaling the official Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, to scour the conquered territories for masterpieces. His personal train, Asia, becomes a rolling treasure chest, hauling stolen paintings, statues, and tapestries back to Germany. In Paris, he makes frequent visits to the Jeu de Paume Museum, which the Nazis use as a clearinghouse for confiscated Jewish art. Göring strolls through the galleries like a kid in a candy store, pointing his marshal's baton at Rembrandts, Rubens's, and Goya's, marking them for his personal collection at Karen Hall. He justifies this theft with a twisted sense of entitlement and pseudo-legalism. He often forces the owners to sign bills of sale for a fraction of the value, or trades degenerate modern art which he despises but knows has international market value for the classic old masters he covets. He spends hours arranging and rearranging his stolen hoard, finding a peace in the silent beauty of the canvas that he can no longer find in the war room. He envisions Karen Hall becoming a museum that will outshine the Louvre, a legacy of his refined taste, completely dissociating the beauty of the art from the brutality used to acquire it. Back in Stalingrad, the end has arrived. By late January 1943, the German perimeter has collapsed into a few isolated pockets of resistance. On January 30, the 10th anniversary of the Nazi seizure of power, Göring takes to the radio to deliver a speech to the nation. In a display of staggering tone deafness, he compares the dying soldiers of the Sixth Army to the ancient Spartans at Thermopylae, declaring that thousands of years from now, Germans will speak of this battle with holy reverence. To the mothers and wives of the soldiers who are being marched into Soviet captivity, the speech is a final insult. The illusion of the jovial, caring leader is shattered forever. When General Paulus finally surrenders on February 2, contrary to Hitler's orders to commit suicide, The Führer's rage is apocalyptic, although he publicly blames Paulus. Privately, the blame settles squarely on the shoulders of the Reichsmarschall. The failure of the airlift is the turning point in their relationship. Hitler stops inviting Göring to the daily military conferences. And when they do meet, the interactions are frosty and filled with thinly veiled contempt. Göring is stripped of his influence over the strategic direction of the war, reduced to a figurehead who is tolerated only for his past services and his propaganda value. Sensing his fall from grace, Göring withdraws further from Berlin. He spends weeks at his private estates, surrounding himself with his family and his sycophants, refusing to read reports that contain bad news. He focuses on designing new uniforms, hunting stags in the Rominten Heath, and expanding his mausoleum. He becomes a phantom figure to the German public, who rarely see him anymore. The Iron Man, who once vowed to protect them from enemy bombs, is nowhere to be found as the first heavy Allied air raids begin to strike deeper into the Reich, bringing the war to the German doorstep. The British Royal Air Force, now joined by the American 8th Air Force, begins the systematic destruction of the German industrial base. The round-the-clock bombing campaign starts to take shape, with Americans bombing by day and British by night. Göring's earlier boasts that the Ruhr would never be bombed come back to haunt him with vengeance. When he does visit bombed-out cities, he is no longer greeted with cheers but with icy silence or open hostility. On one occasion, he attempts to speak to angry civilians in a devastated neighborhood, only to have them point to his immaculate white uniform and ask if his wife is still knitting socks for the soldiers, desperate to regain relevance. Göring orders the development of miracle weapons, putting his faith in advanced technology to reverse the tide. He approves funding for jet fighters like the Messerschmitt Me-262, but his inconsistent leadership and constant interference delay their production. He oscillates between demanding faster production and meddling in technical details he does not understand. He blames the aircraft designers, the factory workers, and the fighter pilots for the failures of the air defense, never accepting that his own negligence and the overwhelming industrial power of the Allies are the true causes of the collapse. By the end of 1942, the man who was once the second most powerful figure in Europe has become a liability. He is a bloated, drug-addled shadow of the ace pilot who won the Blue Max. He wanders the halls of his stolen palace, surrounded by the silent gaze of looted portraits, trying to ignore the sound of the air raid sirens wailing in the distance. The war he helped start has turned against him, and the fire he unleashed upon the world is beginning to burn its way back to the heart of Germany. The summer of 1943 brings a biblical catastrophe to the streets of Hamburg, marking the point where the air war turns into sheer annihilation. Under the codename Operation Gomorrah, British and American bombers unleash a firestorm that defies human comprehension, creating hurricane-force winds that suck oxygen out of the air and incinerate 40,000 civilians in a single week. Hermann Göring receives the reports at his headquarters, his hands trembling as he reads the details of asphalt melting and people suffocating in their cellars. The Reichsmarschall knows instantly that his earlier promises of protection were not just empty boasts but fatal errors. He realizes that the war is lost, yet he lacks the courage to confront Hitler with the truth, choosing instead to retreat further into his chemical haze. The German people, once enamored with their jovial leader, now view him with open contempt and bitterness as their homes turn to ash. The name Meyer is whispered in air raid shelters across the Reich, a grim punchline to his arrogant pre-war promise that no enemy bomb would ever fall on the Ruhr. When Göring attempts to tour the devastated cities to boost morale, his armored Mercedes is pelted with stones and angry jeers. He orders his drivers to speed through the ruins, terrified of the very populace that once cheered him. He isolates himself from the public eye, retreating behind the high walls of his estates, where he can pretend that the Third Reich is not crumbling around him. Inside the Luftwaffe, the relationship between the commander-in-chief and his pilots reaches a breaking point of toxic hostility. The young fighter aces, men like Adolf Galland and Johannes Steinhoff, are fighting a desperate battle against overwhelming Allied numbers. Yet Göring accuses them of cowardice and laziness. He cannot accept that the Allies have superior aircraft and better tactics, so he blames the character of his men. He rages at inspection lines, threatening to court-martial decorated heroes and strip them of their medals. The bond of trust that holds a military force together shatters completely, leaving the pilots to fight for their own survival rather than for their leader. The tension explodes in what becomes known as the Fighter Pilots' Revolt in early 1945. A group of the most decorated aces confronts Göring directly, demanding that he stop the insults and allow them to fly the new Messerschmitt Me 262 jet as a fighter rather than a bomber. Göring, feeling his authority challenged, explodes in a tirade of fury. He dismisses their concerns as mutiny, threatens to have them shot, and relieves General Galland of his command. It is a pathetic display of insecurity from a man who has not flown a combat mission in nearly 30 years. He effectively decapitates the leadership of his own air force in the middle of the final battle for Germany. By June 1944, when the Allies land on the beaches of Normandy, the Luftwaffe is a non-entity in the skies over France. Thousands of Allied aircraft darken the sun, strafing German columns with impunity, while only a handful of German fighters manage to take off. The soldiers on the ground look up and coin a bitter saying to identify the planes above them. They say that if the planes are silver, they are American; if they are dark, they are British; and if the planes are invisible, they are the Luftwaffe. Göring is nowhere to be found during the invasion crisis, having retreated to his hunting lodge to nurse his bruised ego and consume more paracodaine. As the Soviet Red Army steamrolls across the borders of the Reich in early 1945, Göring is forced to say goodbye to his beloved Karen Hall. He spends his final days there frantically packing his stolen art collection onto trains bound for the safety of Bavaria. He walks through the great halls one last time, touching the tapestries and the stone fireplaces, knowing he will never return. Before he leaves, he orders the estate to be dynamited to prevent it from falling into Russian hands. As his train pulls away, the thunder of explosives signals the end of his personal kingdom, leaving only rubble where his palace of dreams once stood. On April 20, 1945, the Nazi leadership gathers in the claustrophobic confines of the Führer bunker in Berlin to celebrate Hitler's 56th birthday. The mood is funereal, shaking with the vibrations of Soviet artillery shelling the city center. Göring arrives with his entourage, looking pale and sweating, his uniform hanging loosely on his frame. He urges Hitler to leave the doomed capital and flee to the Obersalzberg in the south to command the final defense from the mountains. Hitler refuses, declaring his intention to stay and die in Berlin. Göring, seizing the opportunity to escape the trap, bids a hasty farewell to his Führer and speeds south through the burning countryside, safely ensconced at his villa on the Obersalzberg. Göring believes he is now the de facto leader of the Reich, waiting only for the confirmation of Hitler's end. On April 23, the chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff, Karl Koller, arrives with shocking news from the bunker. He reports that Hitler has suffered a total nervous breakdown, screaming that the war is lost and that he intends to commit suicide. Göring listens intently, his mind racing through the legal decrees Hitler signed in 1941. That document clearly stated that if the Führer were incapacitated or deprived of his freedom of action, Göring was to immediately assume all powers of the state as his successor. Göring treads carefully, knowing that a misstep could look like treason. But he also believes action is required to save Germany for a negotiated peace. He drafts a carefully reworded telegram to send to the bunker in Berlin. In the message, he asks Hitler to confirm that, based on his decision to stay in the besieged capital, he is no longer free to act. Göring sets a deadline of 10 o'clock that evening for a reply. He states that if he hears nothing, he will assume Hitler is incapacitated and will take command of the Reich to save the nation. He believes he is acting loyally, following the letter of the law to ensure the continuity of government. However, in the poisonous atmosphere of the Berlin bunker, the telegram is weaponized by Göring's oldest enemy, Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, presents the message not as a loyal inquiry, but as a brazen ultimatum and a coup d'état. He twists Göring's words, convincing the deteriorating Hitler that the Reichsmarschall is demanding he resign or face rebellion. Hitler, already on the brink of madness, explodes in a final paroxysm of rage. He denounces Göring as a traitor, a drug addict, and a failure who has corrupted the Luftwaffe and betrayed the fatherland in its darkest hour. Hitler immediately dictates a savage response, stripping Göring of all his rights, offices, and titles. He sends a chilling order to the SS leaders in Obersalzberg, commanding them to arrest the Reichsmarschall for high treason. He adds that if Berlin falls, Göring is to be executed immediately. Back in the south, Göring is waiting anxiously for a confirmation of his new power, perhaps already imagining himself negotiating with General Eisenhower. Instead, he hears the sound of boots on the gravel outside his villa. An SS unit, heavily armed and grim-faced, surrounds the house, cutting the telephone lines and disarming Göring's personal guards. The SS officers storm into the villa and inform a stunned Göring that he is under arrest on the Führer's direct orders. The shock is absolute. The man who spent 20 years as Hitler's most loyal paladin, who marched with him at the beer hall putsch and built the Gestapo for him, is now a prisoner of the very state he helped create. The SS men show him no deference. They confine him to his room and separate him from his staff. They also seize his supply of pills, forcing him into immediate, brutal withdrawal. The chemical shield he has lived behind for years is ripped away, leaving him to face his terror with raw nerves. As the Third Reich collapses in a chaotic swirl of fire and blood during the last week of April, Göring is moved from place to place by his captors. They transfer him to Mautendorf Castle in Austria, unsure of whether to shoot him or release him. The SS guards are conflicted, with some wanting to carry out Hitler's execution order and others looking to save their own skins by keeping a valuable bargaining chip alive. Göring spends these days in a state of physical agony and mental anguish, sweating out the drugs while listening to radio reports of the final battles in Berlin. On April 30, the radio announces the death of Adolf Hitler. For Göring, the news brings a complex mix of grief and liberation. The oath of loyalty that bound him to the dictator is finally broken by death. He assumes that with Hitler gone, the arrest order is void, and that he is now the legitimate head of state. He attempts to take command of the local troops, believing he can still play the role of the statesman who will end the war. He sends messages to the advancing American forces, offering to surrender to them personally. He imagines a chivalrous meeting between soldiers, marshal to general. However, the world has changed, and there is no room left for chivalry or delusions of grandeur. On May 7, a detachment of the US 36th Infantry Division encounters Göring's convoy on a blocked road near Rastatt. He is not greeted as a head of state, but secured as a high-value prisoner of war. The Americans are fascinated by the fat marshal in the dove-grey uniform, stripping him of his medals and his baton as souvenirs, as he is driven away in a jeep, staring at the ruins of the country he helped destroy. Hermann Göring believes his life is over. He does not yet realize that his greatest battle, the fight for his legacy, is just beginning in a courtroom in Nuremberg. May 20, 1945. The luxurious Palace Hotel in Mondorf-les-Bains, Luxembourg, has been converted into a high-security interrogation center known wryly as Camp Ashcan. Hermann Göring arrives not as a dignitary, but as a spectacle, hauling 16 matching monogrammed suitcases filled with silk underwear, medals, and thousands of paracodeine pills. He is a bloated wreck, weighing over 260 pounds, sweating profusely, and demanding to be treated with the deference due a Reichsmarschall. The American commander, Colonel Burton Andrus, is unimpressed by the theatrical display. He immediately orders the confiscation of Göring's luggage, strips him of his fancy uniforms, and, most critically, discovers the massive stash of narcotics hidden in his personal effects. Andrus makes a decision that will fundamentally alter the course of the coming trial. He orders Göring to be weaned off the drugs immediately, forcing him into a brutal cold turkey detoxification. The process is agonizing. Göring shakes, vomits, and suffers from crippling withdrawal pains as the opiates leave his system for the first time in nearly a decade. Simultaneously, he is put on a strict diet, losing 60 pounds of flabby weight in a matter of months. As the fat melts away and the chemical fog lifts, a startling transformation occurs. The lethargic, clownish drug addict vanishes, and the sharp, ruthless fighter pilot of the First World War re-emerges from the chrysalis of his own excess. By the time Göring is transferred to the somber cells of the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg in August 1945, he is physically fit and mentally alert. He enters the prison block not as a broken man, but as the senior surviving Nazi, the ranking defendant among the 21 major war criminals. He immediately asserts his dominance over the other prisoners, bullying the weak and rallying the defiant. He views the upcoming International Military Tribunal not as a court of law, but as a final political battleground. He decides that if he must die, he will die as a martyr for Germany. Refusing to renounce Hitler or the regime he helped build, the trial opens on November 20, 1945. In the wood-panelled courtroom 600, under the glare of floodlights installed for the newsreel cameras, Göring sits in the corner of the dock, wearing a faded, stripped-down Luftwaffe uniform, his eyes scanning the room behind dark sunglasses. He listens intently through his headphones as the prosecutors detail a catalogue of horrors: aggressive war, the plunder of Europe, and the extermination of millions. While other defendants like Albert Speer hang their heads in shame or claim ignorance, Göring remains defiant. He smirks, shakes his head at the prosecution's points, and openly laughs when mistakes are made, treating the proceedings with calculated contempt. The prosecution is led by Robert H. Jackson, a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, who approaches the trial with a dry, document-heavy strategy. Jackson expects to easily dismantle Göring, viewing him as a pompous fool. However, when Göring takes the stand in March 1946, he shocks the courtroom. He speaks eloquently and without notes, recounting the history of the Nazi Party with a mixture of pride and cynicism. He accepts full responsibility for the rearmament, the Anschluss, and the crushing of political opposition, framing them as necessary acts of a sovereign state restoring its dignity. He charms the press gallery and frustrates the judges with his quick wit and mastery of the facts. The climax of the trial is the duel between Göring and Justice Jackson. Jackson attempts to corner Göring on inconsistencies in diplomatic documents, but he is unprepared for the Reichsmarshal's agility. Göring catches Jackson in translation errors, corrects his dates, and calmly explains the political context of his orders, making the prosecutor look unprepared and amateurish. At one point, Jackson becomes so flushed with anger and frustration that he throws down his headphones and refuses to continue. For a few days, it seems as though the prisoner is putting the victors on trial. Göring revels in the victory, boasting to the other defendants during lunch that he was handling the American lawyer like a schoolboy. However, the legal theatrics cannot hide the mountain of evidence regarding the Holocaust. When the prosecution screens films taken by Allied troops at the liberation of Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen, a hush falls over the courtroom. The images of bulldozers pushing skeletal corpses into mass graves strip away the glamour of Göring's defense. He turns away from the screen, refusing to watch, his face pale and unreadable. Later, he claims privately that he knew about the camps but not the extermination, a lie that few believe. The film breaks his spell over the other defendants. The reality of the genocide is too heavy for his charisma to counterbalance. As the trial drags on through the summer of 1946, the unity in the dock fractures. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, actively distances himself from Göring, admitting collective guilt and characterizing Göring as a corrupt disaster. Göring is furious, calling Speer a traitor to the cause. But his influence is waning. He spends his remaining time writing letters to his wife Emmy and his daughter Edda, trying to secure their financial future and managing his own legacy. He knows the verdict is a foregone conclusion, but his fight is now about the method of his execution. He is obsessed with dying like a soldier, by a firing squad, rather than like a common criminal on the gallows. On October 1, 1946, the day of judgment arrives. The elevator brings Göring up to the dock one last time. He stands stiffly at attention as the British judge, Sir Geoffrey Lawrence, reads the verdict. He is found guilty on all 4 counts: conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The judge pronounces the sentence, death by hanging. Göring listens without flinching, his face a mask of stone. He removes his headphones, turns sharply, and descends back into the bowels of the prison. Back in his cell, his composure cracks momentarily as he realizes his request for a soldier's death will likely be denied. He files a formal appeal to the Control Council, asking not for mercy, but for a change of execution method. He argues that as a Reichsmarshal and a decorated officer, he should be shot. The board refuses, determined to strip him of any lingering military honor. The date is set for the early hours of October 16. The gymnasium of the prison is converted into an execution chamber, with 3 black wooden gallows erected. The sound of hammers and saws echoes through the cell block, a psychological torture for the condemned men waiting for their turn to climb the 13 steps. On the night of October 15, just 2 hours before the executioner is scheduled to come for him, Hermann Göring lies on his small cot. He is calm. Having made his final preparations, he has written a final letter to the prison commandant, claiming he has had the cyanide capsule in his possession the entire time, hiding it in a jar of pomade, and even his navel to avoid detection during the frequent strip searches. The true source of the poison remains a mystery to this day, whether it was passed to him by an American guard he befriended or hidden in his luggage. But Göring has successfully outmaneuvered his captors one last time. At 10:44 p.m., a guard peering through the observation window sees Göring bring his hand to his mouth. A moment later, the prisoner begins to convulse, his face turning a deep purple, a choking sound escaping his throat. The guard sounds the alarm, and Colonel Andrus and the doctors rush into the cell. But it is too late. The scent of bitter almonds hangs heavy in the air. Shards of glass and a brass casing are found in his mouth. Hermann Göring lies dead, a slight, mocking sneer fixed on his face. He has cheated the hangman, denying the Allies the satisfaction of putting the rope around his neck. The suicide throws the prison into chaos. The officials are furious, terrified of the public relations disaster. To prove to the world that he is truly dead, they prop his body up on the coffin box and parade the international press through the room to take photographs. The once mighty Reichsmarschall lies shoeless in his pajamas, his face discolored by the poison, while the other 10 condemned Nazis are hanged one by one in the gymnasium. Göring's body is left to wait. The final act of the Nuremberg trials concludes with the creaking of the trapdoors, but the empty noose reserved for number 1 hangs limp. In the pre-dawn darkness, the bodies of the hanged men and the corpse of Hermann Göring are loaded onto trucks and driven to a secret destination. In a final, supreme irony, they are taken to the crematorium at the Dachau concentration camp. There, the ovens that once burned the victims of the regime are fired up to consume its leaders. Göring's body is pushed into the flames, reducing the man who looted Europe to a pile of grey ash. The ashes are then taken to the Konwenzbach, a small tributary of the Isar River, and scattered into the muddy water to ensure that no grave would ever become a shrine for neo-Nazis. The water carries the remains away, dissolving them into the earth of the country he helped destroy. Hermann Göring leaves behind a legacy of contradictions, a hero of the air who became a drug addict, a cultured art collector who was a barbarian thief, and a jovial man who signed death warrants with a smile. In the end, his intelligence and charisma served only to make his crimes more monstrous. He died as he lived, narcissistic, dramatic, and ultimately destructive, escaping human justice, but leaving his name etched forever in the blackest pages of history.